We obviously have a wide range of different forms of media out there, and each of these has its own advantages and disadvantages. So, we're going to focus a little today on the differences between print media and broadcast media. So, first, we'll take a look at the print media. This is obviously things that are printed. So, you see, for example, in the background there, this is the offices of the New York Times, a newspaper that everyone recognizes. So, we're going to talk about, like, how newspapers serve as a link between the people and the government. It's pretty easy to figure out what is print media. We're talking about a media source that you like read. So we're mostly talking about newspapers and magazines, like older forms of print media. These are obvious printed forms where printed mediums where we get information about the government. We would also consider news websites, and often these are also just newspaper or magazine websites, but we have news websites that are specifically focus on print instead of like video presentation. And our book will talk a lot about blogs, which was a form of reporting in the early 2000s that is mostly gone away, but is kind of seeing a transition back today in what we call like Substacks, where this allows like journalists run their own websites and journalists write their own stories independent of a newspaper or magazine, and people follow the journalist directly. So these would be examples of print media. These are just some examples of some print media that we definitely want to make sure that we know. These are the first three here are national newspapers: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Now, the first two of those are based in New York, the Washington Post based in Washington, D.C., of course, but these cover politics. They cover national politics a great deal. And so these are what we rely on to get information about about the national government and what it's doing. They have like the closest relationships to government officials. This is what the government officials read to get information and things like that. Time magazine is just a similar one. It's just one of many magazines that cover politics, but this is one that tends to get a lot of attention from the policymakers themselves. So like when they do interviews that are on the cover of Time magazine and things like that, it's a big deal. The New York Times is what we call the paper of record. It is like it gives us a national history of what's going on. So it's recording events, and these are things that we can go back to and look up, which is one of the benefits of print media. And so let's talk about the benefits of print media. It has several advantages over the use of broadcast media. And the biggest one of those is that print media is better at doing in-depth coverage. Like there's no time limit for print media. It basically you can include as much information as the literal printed pages allow. So like if your newspaper story is super long, it's very easy to make your newspaper a little longer, or something like that. It doesn't have to fit into a certain time frame like a broadcast news story often does. And so that makes print media better able to explain issues, like that they can do a much better job of focusing on policies and explaining the causes and the impacts of policies, and doing a great job at evaluating policy. The other great thing about print media is it is a little less time sensitive because it doesn't focus necessarily on like this story is happening right now as we type, the way that like broadcast media does. Print media is more, tends to take like a bigger picture look at things, and is also a great opportunity for people to be able to go back and see the reporting like in the time, like as a primary source. It's just a little easier to access this way than broadcast media can be. So, print media's advantages are being able to cover things in depth, being able to explain issues, and that they're not necessarily super time sensitive. We'll regularly see stories in print media, even if it was written a couple of years ago, can still be really important information for us today. There's also a lot of disadvantages to using print media. So, print media, one of the disadvantages is that its audience is higher educated. It requires a more educated audience, especially, if we're talking about like long, in-depth analysis of different policies or different officials and things like that. That requires a very educated audience. And so that goes with the next point here, which is that you have a much smaller audience, a lot less people pay attention. The number one news source for people in the country is watching local news on television. Very, very few people still subscribe to and read a newspaper every day. So you have a much smaller audience when using the print media. And also, one of the things that limits the audience is that print media requires work. You have to sit down and devote the time to like interact with the media. You have to sit down and read it. It requires a lot of work from the audience. And so that really serves to limit the audience too, in a way that like TV news is very passive. Like you just turn it on, you can listen, you can tune it out, whatever. But print media requires active participation in getting the information. And another difference we want to focus on with print media is the way that their freedom is protected. So, obviously, we know the First Amendment well at this point. We know that the First Amendment guarantees a free press. That means that the government can't control what information the print media reports. Very important rule here, there is no prior restraint. That means that the government cannot censor the print media. They can't prevent the print media from printing something. They may go back and, punish people after the fact or whatever, and that's not the same thing. They can't stop something from being printed and reaching the people. And that's not necessarily the case with broadcast media. All right, so let's take a few minutes to look at broadcast media and talk about all the ways that it's different than print media. So here we see like, a news program that comes on NBC. So it's a television channel that is broadcast into people's homes, gives an opportunity for political officials to reach a wide audience. Broadcast media, pretty easy, just like print media. With these are the things that are broadcast into people's homes, and of course, like newer developing types of media on the internet would fit into this category too. But especially, we're talking about TV and radio. So TV and radio are the main types of broadcast media that we're going to be focusing on here. We'll talk a little bit about the internet, but broadcast media, we really are referring to TV and radio, and we call it broadcast because it reaches a wide audience, and so this is like in the airwaves that are delivered across the country and can reach people in their homes. Now, often when we're talking about broadcast media, we're talking about the major broadcast networks. So we're talking about NBC, CBS, ABC, and Fox. These are channels that you can get on TV without any kind of subscription, without cable or anything like that. You literally just have an antenna, and your antenna picks up the signal to these stations. So NBC, CBS, ABC, and Fox. Now, this I want to make a point here. We're not talking in the stuff we're talking about today. We're not talking about Fox News, the cable channel. We're going to treat cable as something completely different because that is something that people choose to purchase. All of these networks are technically entering your home with or without your permission. Like you may not have the equipment to get these channels, but the signal is in your home. And so this is what we're talking about with broadcast media. Same for radio. All radio stations that you can pick up on a regular radio in your car would be considered broadcast media. There's a lot of great things about broadcast media. The biggest of those is that that media allows for live coverage. So when like an emergency is happening, like for example, you see over there on the left, there might be like an emergency, like in this case, a military crash. We can cover this live. We can get the information to people almost immediately. People can watch and see the news take place on their own. A lot of this, because of this, more people are willing to pay attention. We had said print media requires a lot of work, and broadcast media just requires turning the TV on and sitting there. So a lot more people are willing to pay attention to this. And because of that, because the audience on TV and radio is so much bigger than newspapers, government officials are more likely to use it. They know that they can reach more people by like appearing on television than they can by giving an interview to a magazine or a newspaper. So we get a lot more interaction with government officials on broadcast media. There are disadvantages to the broadcast media too. We had mentioned that it's a passive activity. People may turn it on and not always pay attention, and so the broadcast media does tend to focus on entertainment as much as they can. And so in news reporting and stuff, that means that, they may make the choices about which stories are most important based on what they think the most people will pay attention to. And so we see a lot more focus on controversy and scandal, as we see over there in the picture, like a lot of focus on um, Hillary Clinton during the 2016 campaign was on her scandals, because that's the kind of thing that is exciting and gets viewers to watch. And Hillary Clinton's stances on policies are boring and people don't pay attention. So broadcast media is going to make their choices based on what will get the biggest audience. They also have a limited time frame. Like, television shows are a set amount of time. And so rarely do they spend a lot of time explaining all that you would need to know to really understand what's going on about a particular policy or maybe news event. So, they're just kind of giving us the surface level material, and we don't necessarily understand the context of what's going on. So they don't have like the unlimited space, for example, that a newspaper or magazine could provide to get a viewer all the information that they need. And the other thing here is that it has a much shorter lifespan. Broadcast media tends to exist only in the moment. Like, certainly we can like look up old news broadcasts and stuff, and they're saved and all that, but it'd be really weird for you to just go back and go back and rewatch a news report from 2 months ago. Like, watch a whole episode of the news from 2 months ago. It wouldn't really serve a lot of a purpose, where if you read a newspaper or magazine issue from a couple of months ago, you're still probably going to learn a lot more information that is still relevant. And so broadcast media's disadvantage is its very short lifespan. We mentioned freedom of the press, and broadcast media certainly does get protected by freedom of the press, much like the newspapers, but they do have more rules that they have to follow here. Um, the airwaves are regulated by the government. So the government provides the like TV and radio signals that companies use to broadcast this information into your home. And so there are some rules that they have to follow about like the things they can show, the language they can use, and things like that. So they don't have the like 100% freedom that the print media has. And so we're going to talk about these differences a lot when we kind of explore what the FCC does. All right, so that's helping us explain the differences between print and broadcast media. Pretty simple stuff, things that I think you guys already understand. So now we're going to focus on the roles of both of these. We're going to focus on the media as a whole and try to explore the ways that it impacts politics.